In a recent podcast episode, we were talking with our guest about grammar school for Shakespeare's lifetime. The conversation led to what subjects were being taught, including math, which made me wonder, would Shakespeare have studied things like algebra, geometry, or trigonometry in his elementary classroom? Let's find out right now on That Shakespeare Life. Hey there, I'm Cassidy Cash. I'm the host of That Shakespeare Life. This is the channel where we explore the history of life in 16th and 17th century England the way Shakespeare would have lived it. We look at lots of little specific life things that happened from this time period, all the way from the playhouses to what you would eat and drink. And like today, we're learning about what you would learn in your school if you went to school there. If this sounds fun to you, then hit that like and subscribe button because we're here every week. As ever, when I ask these questions that seem really straightforward and simple, there is just a mountain of history to uncover about it, and I'm always surprised at how much information there is to learn. But a small sliver of it here to answer our question of what Shakespeare would have learned about math is that mathematics itself, of course, has existed for centuries, well before Shakespeare, but math wasn't new for Shakespeare's lifetime, but it was during the early and middle 16th centuries that mathematicians were discovering new formulas for things like the root of cubic and quartic, that's fourth degree, polynomials in terms of polynomials coefficients. And if you're in 9th, 10th, or 11th grade, you will definitely recognize words like coefficients and polynomials. And these formulas were new for Shakespeare's lifetime. And those are a lot of math words, but what I'm trying to share is that they were finding out things like what math did and how you could use those numbers to explain things in a way that they hadn't applied those numbers before Shakespeare's lifetime. These discoveries were quite significant for their time since it added to what the ancients had known about math and showed that math could be used to answer and solve much more complex equations than they had realized before. And that's really neat, but it also means that in Shakespeare's elementary classroom, these theories weren't being taught there as standard fare because, of course, they're only newly discovered. Additionally, while math is very old, the writing down and certainly the printing of math into things like textbooks was a brand new concept for Shakespeare's lifetime since the printing press hadn't been around until the 15th century. So they're just now printing things in books. So the writing down of English as a whole, since it was during the 16th and 17th century that people were hashing out how they were going to spell things and what symbols were going to represent things like exclamations. So exclamation points and question marks and these symbols for describing things that you were saying in English were being experimented with as well. So writing down your math concepts was a brand new thing for Shakespeare's lifetime. Now, if you're interested in things like the history of spelling or the history of the punctuation marks, like exclamation points and the question mark, we have specific podcast episodes that go into the history of that for Shakespeare's lifetime that you can check out in the links below this episode. So I'll link to those. So if you want to know more about punctuation marks, go there. But what all of this means in terms of symbols and writing stuff down is that when you're learning math in Shakespeare's lifetime, symbols like finding x or the symbol that you're going to use for the square root symbol, these were all still being sorted out of which ones we're going to use and when are we going to use them. The concepts behind them, like taking a square root, certainly existed, but writing it down and the way you're going to write it down in English was a new practice. There were people that were writing about establishing a system of symbols for algebra before this time, but those efforts were a mixed bag of results, and they hadn't caught on in any kind of uniform way in Europe. So until this point in the history of mathematics, algebraic problems were either presented verbally, so you talked through how you were going to work this, or they were a combination of words and abbreviations. The fact that it took so long to develop algebraic notation is because math is just hard to learn. And if you're a student and you've taken algebra, you know that learning all of these symbols and making sense of, A, B, C, X, the two coefficients, whatever, it's all difficult to learn it all and put it all together because it's a different way of expressing your spoken ideas. And that's reflected in the history of mathematics because it took mathematicians millennia of working verbally with algebra and the concepts until they were familiar enough to be able to assign symbols to them and express them with these abstract labels. So I don't know if you're like me, I'm not really sure the symbols behind math was an advancement, but I'll let you sort that out. Anyway, A few important people involved in the development of mathematics from this time period that you should know about would be Francois Viète. He lived from 1540 to 1603 and published a book called An Introduction to the Art of Analysis. This book outlines a system of symbols that denotes known and unknown quantities, and it was a foundational step in the written expression of algebra. There was another man named Harriot who lived from 1560 to 1621. Also, these men are contemporaries of William Shakespeare, and they wrote down their ideas about using symbols for math, but Harriot's work wasn't published until after his death, so his work wasn't impactful for the life of William Shakespeare, but it did get written during Shakespeare's lifetime. Another major advancement for the study of math that happened in Shakespeare's lifetime was the advent of the decimal point to represent fractional quantities, like 0.5 is a half. Now, this notation was used in Arabic number system as well as in Chinese number systems for centuries before the 16th century. But it wasn't until the 16th century with publications like La Tienne, which was published by Simon Stevin in the 16th century, that the use of decimal fractions became widespread in Europe. Now, I have a paper I will link you to below this episode also that goes into that in way more detail, including equations, if you'd like to see how the math developed. You have to be a certain kind of person to find that really interesting, but if that's you, I'll link you to the paper and you can go through all the nitty-gritty math stuff there. Now, all of these changes happened for the understanding of math and the written expression of algebra doesn't mean that William Shakespeare wasn't taught math in school. In fact, mathematics was considered a necessary skill, particularly for the elite in Shakespeare's lifetime, but it was more computational algebra. As I mentioned, they were working through these math problems verbally. They were talking through things like how to add and subtract, multiply, divide, and definitely how to keep fiscal accounts. In fact, there is a math book, I suppose it could be considered a textbook, that was used to teach students mathematics. And one of the problems that is listed in that book from this time period includes asking students to calculate the interest on a loan. So they say, if you borrow this much money and you have to go pay it back, how much do you have to pay it back? And so there were very real life problems based on what the kids were going to be doing as adults and wanting to make sure that they knew how to do that. The difference is that most of the subjects were taught verbally and based on real life situations like account books for a business. And in many small towns, private schools and private tutors were the source for the mathematics education. And it included learning how to read, learning how to write, and learning how to count, not necessarily working through some of those fourth degree polynomials that I mentioned before. That was a new concept for math and wasn't necessarily taught in what we would think of as elementary school for Shakespeare. So that's a whole lot of history and information to answer our question this week, but the answer is yes. Shakespeare would have learned some basic math, though he probably didn't have access to algebra and geometry education that kids enjoy in most Western high schools today. So he would have learned math in a completely different way, and he wouldn't have had to deal with polynomials. So yay, Shakespeare. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.